Hope you can see that okay now. Just give me a little nod if you can. Yeah? Yeah. Okay, good stuff. Okay, here's what you can expect from my presentation. So I will explain my social work background, as I mentioned. I'll also talk to you about my organisation, BASWA, which is the British Association of Social Workers. I'll talk to you about the George Floyd murder, as Amrit mentioned, but also Black Lives Matter and the resurgence of that movement, not the political organisation, and why I feel that is relevant to social work. I'll also outline the barriers to anti-racism in social work and specific organisational responses. I'll also share some ideas on implementing anti-racist reforms within social work, and then there will be opportunity for questions at the end, and also throughout. Take notes if you like, but I don't feel it's essential. You will have a copy of this presentation to be able to view in your own time. There are hyperlinks throughout, so there are lots of different links that will evidence much of what I'm saying, I feel. So do take your time to kind of use it as a tool to develop yourselves personally and professionally. In terms of my social work background then, starting from the bottom, I worked as a placements officer for a private fostering organisation in administration to begin with. I worked primarily in the office, but it gave me an insight into social work and how foster placements operate and so on. And that really whet my appetite in terms of social work and wanting to learn more and develop my own experience. I then took up an opportunity working for the National Probation Service as a probation services officer on a intensive supervision and surveillance programme, working with repeat offenders aged between 18 and 25 for a couple of years. That was a really successful programme, and it was eventually subsumed within the National Probation Service as it was then. I was then asked to work with offenders aged between 18 to 65, and being quite young myself at the time, roughly early 20s, I felt that a lot of my time was spent really breaching predominantly older white males, which effectively meant sending them back to prison. And it just felt quite patronizing. So I felt I needed to work with a client group closer to my age. So I applied for a role at Sheffield Youth Offending Service, and I worked there in the bail and remand team, which involved undertaking court work and work within the community. I really enjoyed that work. And part of the role there allowed me to apply to be sponsored to undertake my social work degree through my employer. So I did that, and my 2 student social work placements were in adult mental health services, working in the community with people with ongoing, continuing needs with regards to mental health. I then also had a placement in the duty and assessment team, working in child protection. And then I worked as a young person's advisor, working with care leavers alongside that as part of my sponsorship. That was the arrangement really, that I worked full time alongside studying, but I was also provided those placements. My first qualified role was as a supervising social worker, working for another private fostering agency and undertaking the role that I very much set out to do, which I saw as a placements officer right at the beginning. So I felt really fortunate to be able to undertake that role, which I did for about roughly 7 or 8 years prior to moving to BASWA, where I've been at BASWA now for about 3.5 years. My role is as a professional officer, social worker, and more recently anti-racism lead, but I do like to embellish that and call it a visionary role, as I do think it involves quite a lot of insight, creativity, and kind of considering various sort of factors and giving my own perspective and opinion on that, and I will elaborate further on that. My organisation then, BASWA, the British Association of Social Workers. We were established in 1970, and we're the professional association for social workers in the UK. We're a member-led organisation which promotes social work, the interests of those working within the profession, and of course people who use services. We have over 21,000 members across England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, and all of our members are social workers at different stages of their career. And we pride ourselves on being the strong, independent voice of social work and social workers. And you'll see the branding there in the corners of that slide of how it's sort of changed over the years since 1970. So the BASWA mandate is about us being strong. We build strength and unity through vision and purpose, increasing our membership, developing our services, and influencing across the nations of the UK, in Europe and globally. In terms of our independence, we maintain our independence from governments and employers in order to be able to act in the best interest of the profession and social work professionals. Our voice, we ensure a strong and positive voice in the media, with governments and working with their agencies in order to speak up for social work and social workers and for people who use services. We campaign and lobby in order to have the best possible influence on policy, legislation and practice. Social work itself as a profession, we promote ownership of social work values and ethics through the Code of Ethics, which I'll mention shortly, knowledge, education and practice. We defend, develop and strengthen social work as a unique profession rooted in social justice, which is very much about what my presentation is about today, and respect for human dignity and worth. We provide professional advice, support for practice and training and development opportunities. We also represent and defend social workers individually and collectively. And I'll elaborate on what some of that looks like for you just over the next slides before I get into the main thrust of the anti-racism presentation. So in terms of what we do for social work and social workers, just to give you a brief overview of that. As I mentioned before, there are hyperlinks throughout this presentation. So where you can see words underlined, when you get your copy of this presentation, if you click on those links, it will provide you with more information. So starting from the top, the Code of Ethics for Social Work, the Professional Capabilities Framework, the PCF, those are important sort of codes and frameworks which are very inherent really within BASWA's kind of core work. Again, those links will take you to those resources. We collaborate with employers, education providers, such as Think Ahead, but also other conventional universities as well. We collaborate with service user groups and other stakeholders. In terms of specialist national groups that we have groups that cover children and families, adult social work, mental health, criminal justice, students and newly qualified social workers, and one that focuses on professional development. We have an established network of BASWA branches nationwide. We have events. That link there will take you to the BASWA events page. For the last 12 months or so, all of our events have been online. There are opportunities for non-members as well as members, so do have a look. We also host a range of conferences and webinars. We have a policy and research department. There's various activities that they're involved in across the UK. And of course, we liaise with the social work regulator, Social Work England. Just a few more examples. We also have a parliamentary officer who liaises with MPs and civil servants. As professional officers, we would also have those interactions with MPs and so on. We have a training and development arm called Prof D, which focuses on training, continuous professional development and career development. We're affiliated with the Social Workers Union, which is a trade union that offers advice and representation for members. There are a number of national consultation responses, campaigns and lobbying activities. A recent consultation response was the mental health white paper, for example, some of you might be aware of. The response to that is available on the BASWA website, so do have a look at that. There's also the Black and Ethnic Minority Professional Symposium, or BPS, which is a group that I co-founded last year. I'll go on to talk more about that group later on. Very much providing a kind of online sort of safe space for social workers of colour to be able to share their experiences and their views, but to also mobilise and strategise against institutional and structural racism in social work. I mentioned before about our presence in the media. So we raise the profile of social work in various media platforms, TV, radio, print, online, etc. One of our fundamental aims really is to promote the collective professional identity of social workers. Thank you for bearing with me through that, and I hope that gave you a decent overview of the work that BASWA is involved in. Certainly not exhaustive, hopefully insightful. So moving on to anti-racism in social work then. This is some of the images really that I wanted to share with you at the outset, so you get some idea of where I'm coming from in terms of anti-racism. My perspective on anti-racism in social work is both personal and professional. There are very few Black male social workers, and so my perspective really is a minority within a minority view, I guess, but valid nonetheless. My opinions don't represent all Black and ethnic minority people's opinions. We're not a homogenous group. And I refuse to be the tokenistic Black voice of BASWA. I'm one of many Black voices in social work. I'm just fortunate really that because of my role, because of some of the work I'm involved in, I'm able to get my voice heard, but I don't necessarily think I'm right all of the time. I just, just trying to be as honest and as authentic as I can. I'm not an expert in organizational development or leadership. However, I am an expert with lived experience of personal and professional racism in life and in social work. And these are purely my opinions. This presentation focuses on Black and ethnic minority social workers, not service users. Of course, that's why all of us gravitate towards social work. And I've found through my work that there is an extensive body of work around the experiences that service users of colour face, but there's very little about social workers of colour and the racism they face, both from service users, but also colleagues and managers and institutions, etc. So that's really the focus of my work. And again, I hope those images there give you some idea of the perspective and tone. Why was George Floyd's murder such a catalyst? George Floyd was murdered by a police officer, and the world has seen the evidence. His murder was the latest in a long line of atrocities, brutalities, and calamities endured by Black and other ethnic majority communities. This has a long history, longer than is sometimes convenient for honest acknowledgement. Some commentators refer to George's death, which is a dilution of what occurred. He was brutally murdered. The context to George's murder is both emotive and cumulative. The Amy Cooper race grenade, which was an incident that occurred just prior to his murder, you'll see via that link when you view your version of this. Endless examples of police brutality cases in the US and UK. Modern day systems of oppression and the historic and ongoing suppression of the effects of slavery and colonialism in mainstream education. These factors can accumulate and create an acute sense of anger and rage. These emotions sometimes manifest into civil disorder and protests. However, anarchic extremists are known to infiltrate protests and covertly fuel acts of looting and violence, which are used to discredit legitimate protesters. This detracts from the causal factors that trigger protests. Interestingly, little is reported about the long-standing looting of Africa's natural resources. And again, the images there, I hope, complement much of what I've tried to capture in that text, I think sometimes the reasons as to why people feel the need to protest are quite often not thought about or considered. Black Lives Matter is a global movement demanding for Black lives to be valued equal to white lives. There is a long and enduring history of this not being the case. The retort of white or all lives matter in response to BLM is not comparable or relevant. This is like asking, what about colon cancer during a discussion about breast cancer? Or advising a bereaved mother that all lives matter at her child's funeral. Save the whales does not mean other sea life is unimportant. White lives have always mattered, so to keep proclaiming white lives matter adds excessive value to them, tilting us further towards white supremacy. BLM has its critics, but it is unclear why a movement that promotes equality is demonized by some who vehemently claim they are not a racist and advocate for freedom of speech. Now, I've put I've emphasized the A in sort of alongside racist there because I think most people will consider racism to be binary, either you are or aren't racist. But actually, I think there's a spectrum of racism that people need to look at in the round. Can I ask that everybody goes on mute, please? I'm just getting some feedback there. Thanks very much. Here is a chronology from last year, which I'm not going to go through in any depth. You know, you could go through it when you get your copy of this, but it just gives you some idea really as to the context of how my work was triggered really and instigated in this regard. So it began from the Amy Cooper race grenade, as I mentioned before, and then there's a series of events really that I was involved in a kind of unofficial capacity, I guess. You know, I wasn't in the anti-racism role then. I was undertaking a lot of this work in my professional officer capacity. So it was very kind of proactive and driven, I guess, by a lot of my emotion at the time, a lot of my feelings about the murder and the kind of impact that had on me and the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement. So yeah, that's really just for context, that slide. And the chronology is continued here. You'll see to the right there the image of the KCMG medal. I'll just talk about that briefly. That was a campaign which I kind of inadvertently started last year for BASWA. I was sent that image by somebody in a WhatsApp group that I'm part of. I'd never seen it before, and it transpired that it's been in existence for hundreds of years. And is still awarded sort of now. And because of that, I tweeted about it. That link there will take you to the original tweet. Actually, that tweet was deleted by Twitter, but I'll come on to that shortly. But there was a tweet that I did at the time, which went viral, and that kind of kickstarted a campaign, which resulted in BASWA writing a letter to the Queen and her office at Buckingham Palace to ask for that image to be replaced. That campaign is ongoing. So yeah, that was sort of the early days really, as I see it now, in terms of my work in anti-racism in 2020. The BPS as well, just further down, the Black and Ethnic Minority Professional Symposium, is the group that I referred to earlier on, and that group is still in existence. We've undertook quite a lot of work in a short space of time, so I'm also very proud of that group. So the current position, as I mentioned, the KCMG campaign is ongoing. We have received an acknowledgement from Buckingham Palace, and our letter has been redirected to the Cabinet Office. However, in a bizarre twist, the original tweet, which went viral, has now been deleted from Twitter. We have asked Twitter to explain this, but no response has been received. We know silence on racism is complicity with the oppressors. Silence can also be construed as blatant racism in some scenarios. It seems when our oppressors choose not to attack us, the wall of silence is their other favoured tactic. Open dialogue has remained a prominent source of conflict resolution for good reason. It works. It helps to positively undermine any covert or overt power imbalance. BASWA England will continue to educate, equip and empower social workers of colour and allies. As an organisation, we realise that we are not immune to the perils of white supremacy and whiteness. However, BASWA has shown a willingness to address and tackle these issues internally and within the profession more broadly. We will consider all anti-racist proposals from partnership organisations and specialist collaborators that will potentially benefit social work. Now, it's some time since I wrote that slide, admittedly. I think probably that slide is probably 6 months old. And in that time, I think there's lots of evidence that as an organisation, we've done that. Since I wrote that slide, we've employed another anti-racism lead, my colleague Chantel Thomas, who covers the UK. We've also employed another colleague called Narinda Sidhu, who is our Equalities, Diversity and Inclusion lead for the UK. So there's been those internal appointments. There's work underway to look at the professional capabilities framework and the code of ethics in terms of these values and ethics. And we've also recently published the George Floyd anniversary report, which covers all of the anti-racism activities that have taken place across the UK over the last 12 months. Again, that's available on the BASWA website. So that shows what we've done for the profession as well. So I don't want to sort of sit here too long bigging us up, but you know, I think we've demonstrated our commitment really to anti-racism and a lot of the activities we've been involved in. Here are some examples of my own activism on anti-racism in social work. There's the book Outlanders, which was published back in March, which I co-edited and contributed to with Siobhan McLean. There's various contributors to that project. It is the hidden narratives from social workers of colour. It includes essays, stories, poems, and miscellaneous works, all from social workers of colour, providing their perspectives, not only on anti-racism or racism as such, but just various aspects of their working life and their view on social work, which to my knowledge, there's no other book that has that. So we're really proud of its uniqueness. There was a number of events that I spoke at last year, one being the Guardian Social Lives event. I've already mentioned the BPS group, that's the original flyer there that you can see. And I spoke at an event alongside David Olasuga, which again I was particularly proud of. He's the Black historian, quite often on the BBC that you might be familiar with, and also Chief Social Worker for Children's Services. There's a number of articles that I've written on anti-racism in social work as well, some of which you may have seen. And I'm also honoured to have spoken alongside Gurnam Singh and Kishpati Sinclair, who I consider to be pioneers of anti-racism in social work as well. There's been a number of online events, podcasts, webinars, presentations like this that I've done. Yeah, I'm particularly pleased really with the progress that we've been able to make, but there's lots of work still to do. Okay, this is the Wake Up Show. So there's a big difference between being anti-racist and not wanting to be seen as a racist, as I was saying earlier. People are sometimes more scared of being labelled as racist than they are of actually being racist. An individual or organisation that is anti-racist is much more likely to recognise why they themselves are potentially racist, understand how they have been socialised to be inherently racist, and identify the benefits they receive from the existing racist structures. Those embracing macho, anti-woke, and politically incorrect descriptors as laudable, even a badge of honour, seem unable or unwilling to view introspection, self-reflection, or self-awareness as supreme personal qualities. White psychosis, as described by Kehinde Andrews, is expressed in strange ways. It's a damning indictment on society when to be described as woke or to be a do-gooder or in any way virtuous is considered derisory. This defies my sense of logic and is selective outrage to me. Personally, I think it's an important quality to want to do good for my fellow human beings and strengthen our societal interdependence. I challenge anti-woke people to actually define the word woke. Many of their responses are laced with absurdities. Some will cite the Commonwealth as a victory on race relations. Common, wealth, for who? Possibly a Freudian slip in retrospect. Ignorance allied with power is the most ferocious enemy social justice can have. And that's a quote from James Baldwin, which I've altered slightly. So what is anti-racism? Anti-racism is the belief that all races and ethnic groups are equal and deserving of the same opportunities. But the most important part of anti-racism is the next step, which is to do something about the existing inequality. Anti-racism is the active dismantling of systems, privileges, and everyday practices that reinforce and normalize the contemporary dimensions of white dominance. This, of course, also involves a critical understanding of the history of whiteness. And that's a quote from the book How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi, which I'd recommend you read. And I hope that image there to the right that I've put in kind of supplements what his definition there. This slide is where I've tried to highlight the relevance of anti-racism to social work. Now, you'll notice from the professional standards, the relevant professional standards that I've listed there, there is an explicit mention of anti-racism, hence why I've put relevance really. So just to go through those standards briefly, the relevant standards that I found in this regard, so they start with recognizing differences across diverse communities and challenging the impact of disadvantage and discrimination on people and their families and communities. Promoting social justice, helping to confront and resolve issues of inequality and inclusion. Not abusing, neglecting, discriminating, exploiting, or harming anyone, or condoning this by others. And finally, reporting allegations of harm and challenge and reporting exploitation and any dangerous, abusive, or discriminatory practice or behavior. So those were the standards that I could find that were the closest really to that. But you'll see that there's no explicit mention of anti-racism, anti-oppression, or anti-discrimination. Previous professional standards have, such as from the HCPC, GSCC before that. So for me, I feel there's been some regression in that, and that's something that as an organisation that we'll be looking to seek a review of those standards. But there is a bedrock of social justice in social work in that regard, and we feel it's important that we maintain those fundamental values. I've also talked about the Code of Ethics already and the work that we'll be doing to update those. There's a number of position statements that BASWA have written, one in relation to George Floyd's murder at the time, but one other since around promoting anti-racism, one in response to the Equalities Minister, and some of her comments around sort of white privilege and critical race theory and so on. There's been various statements that are all available on the BASWA website, so I'd encourage you to have a look at those. There's an article there that I've included called Confronting the White Elephant, White Privilege in Social Services, which is a fantastic article, which again, I'd encourage you to read. Cultural competence is a long-standing social work theory. I feel it's something that, is very much kind of revered in social work, but there hasn't actually been a kind of as to how much application there's been of cultural competence in social work. I think it's difficult for us to measure, and based on some of the outcomes that we are aware of in terms of disproportionate representation in fitness to practice hearings, for example, for social workers of colour, then it does beg the question of how much have we embedded that really within the profession. We've talked the talk, have we walked the walk? Not so sure. And finally, there's a movement to decolonise social work education and policy, as there is in broader education and curriculums. And again, that's something that I endorse and encourage. How much of a priority is anti-racism in social work, really? Anti-racism in social work must be fully considered and dismantled through collaboration with Black and ethnic minority social workers in roles as experts with personal and professional lived experience. This is the only way that Black and ethnic minority social workers' basic needs can be properly met and their wide-ranging expertise fully utilised. Of course, this approach can only improve the experiences of Black and ethnic minority service users too. It really is just a question of how much of a priority is anti-racism in social work. And that is the overlying question for me in being involved in this work for just over probably 18 months now. That really is the underlying question in most organizations and most individuals in terms of allyship. Anti-racism, so what? Blah, blah, yawn. If the news of police officers taking selfies beside the bodies of 2 murdered Black sisters, the recent far-right violent protests in London, or the racist comments by Suffolk councillors do not outrage you or alert you to the fact that racism is thriving in this country right now, then you really must consider whether you have sleepwalked into being an opponent of anti-racism. At the very least, we must be self-aware and honest with ourselves and others when our boredom threshold is reached. Boredom can be subliminal and counterproductive to anti-racism at every level. Everyday microaggressions, including banter in the workplace, can fuel violent racist incidents. And that might seem like a bit of a reach, but I will explain later on the correlation between sort of banter in the workplace and violent racist incidents. Workplace racism, pigmentocracy versus meritocracy. Sorry for the wordy slide here, by the way, but I hope this is all resonating. So the covert, entrenched and everyday racism in the workplace is sometimes indicates the lack of quality, cultural diversity and multicultural education and training available to all staff. Surprisingly, it is rarely acknowledged in social work that race is simply a socially constructed idea with no scientific validity, invented and refined principally to oppress people of colour. This has modern and everyday ramifications in the workplace and the working environment. Black and ethnic minority practitioners have reported to BASWA that personal protective equipment has clearly been prioritised and withheld on occasions for their white colleagues. Others explained they were made and ordered to visit service users with suspected COVID-19 with no PPE and no guidance or support, whilst white managers stayed at the office with their supply of PPE and engaged in racist banter. These perverse experiences can be impossible for victims of naked and slippery everyday racism to articulate to others or reconcile internally themselves. Furthermore, these incidents are normalized and subsumed in many workplace cultures, with limited opportunities to professionally offload. And going back to the BPS group that I mentioned that I founded, that was the primary aim, as I said, to provide that safe space for people to be able to professionally offload. And I feel that we've achieved that. Can I ask that everyone goes on mute, please? Just got a bit of feedback there. Thank you. Oh, still getting a bit of feedback. Thanks. Okay, so here is an infographic that I created, which is outlining that anti-Black racism from people without colour involves, and there's a list of different indicators. It's not an exhaustive list. Please don't take notes, because as I said, you will get a copy of this presentation. There are hyperlinks throughout, so you'll be able to look at this in your own leisure. But I will just highlight a few just to underline what anti-Black racism from people without colour, what it looks like. So it's an inability to listen to Black people's problems with empathy and respond with empathy. An inability to take direction from Black people. An inability to celebrate Black accomplishments. Assuming Black people are less capable, educated, or intelligent. Conflating anti-Black racism with issues faced by people without colour. I have to say, I think that really is a kind of important one that I found in this work that especially I've been faced with, to be quite honest. But just moving on. Other examples include downplaying and or glossing over racism in the workplace and society. Knowingly perpetuating stereotypes about Black people. Looking for opportunities to tone police and discredit Black people. Taking no action when faced with clear evidence of racism. Treating Black children like adults, adultification. And finally, unnecessarily trying to compete with Black people. And again, I reiterate, that's not an exhaustive list, but just to give you some insights there. Here is an infographic created by my colleague Gurnam Singh that I referred to earlier on, who I consider to be one of the pioneers, really, of anti-racism in social work. This is an infographic which outlines 4 different types of white identity. And it goes some way to explaining whiteness that I described earlier on, but there are some links specific to that I've included elsewhere. So looking at this infographic then, you can see that there is white supremacy, white indifference, white awareness, and white allyship. And there are indicators for each. So I'm not going to read this slide verbatim, but just to give you a flavour then of what white supremacy, what some of the indicators are for that. So it's a fear, loathing. Oh, I'm getting a bit of feedback there. Can I just ask everyone to go on mute, please? Thank you. So it's a fear, loathing, exoticization of the non-white other, which may be overt or covert. Still getting some feedback, folks. I'm going to ask everyone to go on mute. Thank you. It's characterized by the white gaze, a belief that we live in a meritocracy, subscribes to scientific racism. I'd also include medical racism in that. And white privilege is rationalized as the natural order. And there's an onus on Black people to accept their place. In terms of white indifference, some of the indicators of that, it's characterized by a refusal to take a serious look at racism and views anti-racist initiatives as ideological endeavors linked to culture wars and political correctness. There's a willingness to tolerate, fetishize, or pity the non-white other. For me, that conjures up images of trying to stroke Black people's hair, for example, or viewing as a pet or something like that you might stroke. Happy to take tokenistic gestures, but total refusal to accept one's own complicity in the production and reproduction of racism. And finally, the onus is on Black people to build up their resilience. Then we come across to white awareness. So that would involve a desire to engage with Black issues and people, but only in limited spaces, committees, training events, at work perhaps rather than personally. This may be as a result of feeling guilty of historic racism and or a desire to make some amends. White privilege is recognized and becomes a source of shame and embarrassment. The onus is on white people to overcome their unconscious bias. And then finally, we come across to white allyship. Some indicators of that include a focus on paradigm shifts and concrete interventions. It's characterized by the desire to take responsibility for change, which is not restricted to behavior alone. An ally is willing to share power, privilege, risk, and vulnerability. And the onus is on white people to build sustained partnerships with Black people. So you can see the clear distinctions there. And when I talked about that spectrum of racism earlier on, this is very much the kind of the ideology, I guess, that I had in mind around where people are in terms of these categories. Some people might be straddling more than one category, for example. For others, it might be fluid throughout certain periods of their life. Professional responsibilities. It is imperative that social workers evaluate their roles and moral and regulatory responsibilities. Current race relations require social workers to be proactive and do our homework, to stay contemporarily astute as allies to Black and ethnic minority colleagues and service users. Social workers of colour cannot and should not be expected to fix the racism in their workplace. However, those of us who are confident and capable enough with the right support can have a crucial role in educating, empowering, and equipping ourselves and potential allies and influencers to enhance and shape anti-racism initiatives in our workplace settings. Everyone has a duty to combat racism and other forms of discrimination. You know, obviously I bang on about anti-racism, but I'm well aware there are lots of other types of discrimination out there that needs to be combated. And I think it's important everybody does that in the spaces they occupy. And this includes reporting racist incidents when they occur, forming like-minded alliances with peers to tackle key issues, raising awareness, and making suggestions for positive reform. Here is another infographic for you to consider. You'll see here an iceberg. The tip of the iceberg denotes overt white supremacy, which we all know to be socially unacceptable behaviour by individuals and groups. Below the iceberg, what you'll see is covert white supremacy, which actually is very socially acceptable. I'll give you a moment just to digest that. Okay, moving on. Barriers to meaningful organizational change. Before any meaningful change can be achieved, social work leaders must acknowledge the inherent and intrinsic nature of whiteness, white fragility, white privilege, and white supremacy as unconscious bias in most, if not all, institutions, structures, and organizational cultures. Individual and organizational awareness is an imperative first step for social workers, employers, and educators to address workplace racism effectively. And you'll see there that image, which I think isn't uncommon in a lot of organizations. You know, quite often it comes back to that elephant in the room, which was the name of the article I referred to earlier. Okay, at that point, I'm conscious that, I've given you a bit of a monologue there and spoken at length for some time. I'm happy to invite any questions or comments at this stage. Don't be shy. No question's a silly question, unless it's really silly, as far as I'm concerned. So, Amrit, would you mind fielding some questions, please?
Sure, I think Ella has her hand raised.
Thank you. Just because I can't see people, that's all, and present at the same time.
Hi Wayne, thank you so much for that. While people are thinking, I just wanted to ask you, I was really struck by what you said about Social Work England's standards and how they feel like they've sort of taken steps back from the structures we had in place under previous regimes in social work. And I just wondered, when you've thought about that and discussed it with colleagues, are you reassured that wasn't a sort of deliberate step, it's just sort of a gap rather than, I'm just interested in how that situation's arisen. It feels really surprising to me.
Well, it's a view which I've written about. So I'd encourage people to view my article, I would say, first and foremost, because that gives my my perspective on that. And the articles that I would recommend people read are entitled How White Supremacy is Perpetuated in Social Work Regulation, and there's another called Patiently Waiting, that both look at that issue in some detail. In terms of reassurance, I guess for me, a lot of what I've talked about in terms of my anti-racism is really about, the way I've tried to approach this is being as transparent, I guess, as I can. I recognize that not all of my views people will agree with, but I've tried to promote that dialogue, I guess. So, I would really like to get a dialogue going around reviewing the professional standards, and I know that's something that colleagues within BASW are also wanting to look at and address. So really, we're just we're looking for that opportunity. Anybody else? And thank you, Ella, by the way. I didn't notice you there. Nice to see you. And okay, any other questions? Come on, folks, don't be shy.
I've just put in the chat, you can put them in the chat if you don't say them aloud, but so far we don't have any other questions.
No problem. Maybe I've sort of bamboozled people, information overload. I'm guilty of that sometimes. So I'll move on then, no problem. Here's another infographic for you, and this is called The 4 Dimensions of Racism. You'll see that we have institutional, which is the policies and practices that reinforce racist standards within a workspace or organization. Structural, multiple institutions collectively upholding racist policies and practices, i.e. society. Other examples might be the criminal justice system, the mental health system, the education system. Internalized, which is the subtle and overt messages that reinforce negative beliefs and self-hatred in individuals. And finally, interpersonal, which are racist acts and microaggressions carried out from one person to another. Here's another infographic, which is entitled The Problem Woman of Colour in the Workplace. Now, this is a common issue I've found with lots of women of colour that I've spoken with in social work who have said that they've either been through this experience or they've known people who've been through it. So I'll take you through it very briefly. So the woman of colour enters the organisation. She's met by a white leadership. There's a honeymoon period. The woman of colour feels welcomed and needed and happy. But actually it's a tokenized hire. The reality is that the woman of colour points out issues within the organisation. She tries to work within the organisation structure and policies. She pushes for accountability, but she's met with repetitive injury and microaggressions. She might retaliate, the organization decides that the woman of color is the problem and targets her. The organization labels the conflict as a communication issue or claims that she is not qualified or not a good fit. The response is the organization denies and ignores and blames. The responsibility of fixing the problem is placed on the woman of color. People of color are pitted against one another. There's a denial of racism. And then there's a target and attack approach. And then one way or another, the woman of color exits the organization. So that's quite a generic kind of overview of some of the scenarios that many women of color within social work, but also lots of other spheres and professions and industries find themselves in. So again, a lot of this is just about giving you that insight, really. It's not about pointing the finger. It's not about accusing anybody or, of racism. It's about identifying how structurally, institutionally, interpersonally, these things are happening. Sometimes unwittingly, sometimes knowingly. You can't read yourself into activism. Anti-racism in social work risks being perceived as radical activism or anarchic ideology. Our social work leaders must reverse this flawed belief system. Social work policy, practice, and education needs to properly recognise and reflect that race is a socially constructed idea, as I was saying earlier, with no scientific validity, invented and refined principally to oppress Black people. Race remains an unstable concept because it is superficially based on physical appearance. When race was constructed, people knew very little about DNA, genetics, and human origins. It is an outdated colonial invention that still permeates modern society. Intellectually and morally, as a profession and as a society, we must see beyond what was predetermined for us centuries ago. So, if society is built on plantations of racism, still celebrates racist history and traditions, and reminds us daily of the inescapability of white supremacy, it's not enough for social workers and social work organisations to be colourblind or non-racist. We must be proactively anti-racist. Otherwise, anything else is just tiresome lip service. If anti-racism in social work does not exist for social workers, can it ever truly exist for service users? Anti-racism is absolutely integral to social work. So when will it be given the credence it deserves? Without standing up for our defining values and ethics, what is to stop us succumbing to the pervasive and pernicious postmodern sleaze? Dr. Muna Abdi, a leading anti-racism educator, states that the work of anti-racism is to fight racism wherever you see it, even in yourself. The struggle cannot be found in the pages of a book. You can't read yourself into activism. Sooner or later, you'll have to make a choice. Do what is right. Do what is safe, or do what is right. I hope that connects with you. I talked earlier about the link between workplace banter and racial violence. And this is the infographic that I had in mind, which is called the Pyramid of Hate. The pyramid shows biased behaviours growing in complexity from the bottom to the top. Although the behaviours at each level negatively impact individuals and groups, as one moves up the pyramid, the behaviours have more life-threatening consequences. Like a pyramid, the upper levels are supported by the lower levels. If people or institutions treat behaviours on the lower levels as being acceptable or normal, it results in the behaviours at the next level becoming more accepted. In response to the questions of the world community about where the hate of genocide comes from, the pyramid of hate demonstrates that the hate of genocide is built upon the acceptance of behaviors described in the lower levels of the pyramid. So starting at the bottom, I'll just read a few from each section. Biased attitudes, so looking through the lens of race, but we could look at this through the lens of disability, gender, and so on. But looking at this through the lens of race, this would include racial stereotyping, insensitive remarks, fear of differences, non-inclusive language, microaggressions, etc. The next layer is acts of bias, and that might include racial bullying, ridicule, name calling, etc. Then we might have racial discrimination. So that might be economic, political, educational, employment, housing. Then we might have racially biased motivated violence. So, murder, which is race related, rape, assault, arson. And then above that, at the very top, we have genocide, which is the act or intent to deliberately and systematically annihilate an entire people. And I'm a believer that there are some examples of that across the world community. Okay, I'll pause again at that stage and invite any questions or comments. Got a shy bunch here, Ella. Have you got your hand up again, or is that a legacy hand?
No, it's me. I just sort of trying to encourage people to come forward. I think one of the things that most sort of depresses me in a way about the fact that you're having to do the role that you are for BASW is that one thinks of social work as such a socially minded profession that people come into motivated by a desire to just spread equality and inclusion and exemplify anti-oppressive practice and all the rest of it. So the fact that you're having to go on such a mission to try and bring the sector with you and bring people up to sort of general level of understanding is like a real wake-up call, because people probably feel like they come into this profession and they're with like-minded people, and actually this doesn't need to be such a sort of focus of work and energy. And I guess it's not a question for you, but it's more just to try and get others to come forward. I'm just interested to know how much this resonates and how much people have found there is a gap of understanding and common awareness in the sort of professional circles that you're moving in, or whether you're worried hearing this that you're thinking, oh my goodness, this wasn't what I expected at all from a career in social work. So yeah, I just thought if people don't have questions for you, they might also have reflections on how this interacts with their day-to-day new professional life. So that's all I wanted to say at this point.
Okay, thank you, Ella. And yeah, I mean, some of the points that you raised there, it's true. I think that in terms of social work, that as I mentioned before, this was something that certainly when I came into social work did feel like it was more of a priority, and it's something that for various reasons has just slid down the list of importance, really. Some of that I think is to do with austerity and the impact of that. Some of that is to do with the increased work pressures on social workers for a variety of reasons, some of that by austerity, some of that because of increased managerialism as well within frontline services and bureaucracy and so on. So there's a whole host of different factors, I think, that have either directly or indirectly brought sort of anti-oppression, anti-discriminatory and anti-racist values and ethics. It's just sort of evaporated to some degree. So it's just about, I think, trying to get it back on the page again now, really. I don't think that the work of myself and BASW will necessarily accomplish everything. We won't be able to fix it, but hopefully we can spotlight it and raise enough awareness so we generate, enough interest across social work so we get more buy-in from key stakeholders. That's really what this is about. So thank you for those points.
We have about 5 questions.
Oh, right, excellent. Okay.
So go to Nathan Dunn first, who's raised his hand.
Great, thanks very much, Wayne. Yeah,
Hello.
I have to admit, I find this convicting. Yeah, I probably walked into some form of racism, so thank you.
Very honest.
So the question is, how can you develop a kind of stamina for anti-racism? So the kind of internal drive when perhaps your voice isn't being heard, how do you develop a stamina to be consistent with standing up for that as opposed to just going with the flow?
Okay, I think some of it I touched on earlier when I said that when I talked about education, empowerment, and equipping people, I think that applies to not just victims of racism or people on the receiving end of racism, but also for allies and potential allies as well. So, you know, just going through each one briefly, in terms of educating yourself around issues to do with anti-racism, some of it will involve reading, some of it will involve, you know, kind of exploring different people's ideas about what anti-racism involves and the principles. And there's people far more qualified and scholarly than me, you know, who are involved in anti-racism that I could recommend to you. So that's one aspect of it. Another aspect of it, in terms of empowerment, I see empowerment as allies or potential allies. Thinking of Gurnam Singh's infographic, where he talked about sharing vulnerability, sharing power, sharing risk to some degree, vulnerability and so on. I see allies and potential allies doing that in a way that is authentic to them, that is meaningful to people of colour. And through that, I think that allies and potential allies will develop empowerment. I think they'll naturally be empowered by doing that. And in terms of equipping, I mean, a lot of this is subjective, and it's me just, you know, it's just my ideas, which aren't necessarily right. It's just my view. But around equipping, I think some of that is about making enough change in the space that you occupy, so you're kind of equipping yourself, but also the situation. So, for example, in a work situation or in a, you know, course such as the course that you're on, I guess it's about making people of color who you come into, who you interact with, making them feel at ease and comfortable and understand where you are in your anti-racism journey, and that will equip you then and them for that situation and future situations. Do you see what I mean in terms of that journey and that authenticity? Some of that will make more sense in the next few slides, I think, that I talk about, but I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next, we can go to Emma McGlennon. I know that you've got a question in the chat as well. I wonder if you wanted to say it aloud instead.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you so much. I'm coming to this program from a kind of North American perspective. I'm actually from Minneapolis, not far away from where George Floyd was murdered. So I appreciate you bringing that context to this conversation. I'm particularly interested kind of in your background with working with youth offenders and with the parole system, and being relatively kind of new to both to social work and to its relationship with criminal justice in the UK. I'm wondering kind of what your perspective is on social workers partnering with the police, and kind of more broadly, what is the responsibility of social workers in resisting and even actively dismantling the carceral system, given what we know about its kind of intrinsic relationship with the sustaining and perpetuation of white supremacy. So.
Yeah, okay, yeah, thank you. I mean, that's a complex one there that you've thrown me, Emma, but I will try and answer that in the best way that I can. So in terms of my thinking around social work and criminal justice in this country, when I came into social care, social work, when I worked in youth justice, there was a far stronger bridge between social work and criminal and youth justice at that point. But it was around that time that some of the education became specific to youth justice, qualifications and so on, and just the career kind of pathway just became very specific to youth justice. And it was around that time that I thought, well, I've always wanted to be a social worker, you know, so I was able to seek that sponsorship. But I noticed around that time this kind of split, sadly, between the two. And because I worked with children and young people primarily at that time, who were either in my youth offending role, young offenders. When I worked with care leavers, many of those were young people who, you know, may have been young offenders also, but just had very difficult, you know, challenging lifestyles. And what I found was that split between social work and criminal justice effectively meant that the professionals involved didn't talk to each other. There was this kind of us and them situation that arose. I don't know what it was like necessarily before that, because that was before my time, but I just felt that there was this this real kind of split really between both professions. And now, you know, many years on, they are two very different professions, and the way that manifests itself, it's probably just exaggerated that situation that I've described. I mean, I'm not in frontline practice now, so some of this is me just, you know, speculating, but from what I hear from other people, from what I've observed, you may not be aware that the probation service that I referred to has only just reunified, for example. They went down a road of kind of privatization. It was found that that didn't work, and that actually it caused a lot of problems. There's elements of that in youth justice as well as criminal justice, adults, you know. So again, there's been a kind of regression there, and my hope is that this bridge between both social work and criminal justice, it can be rebuilt to some degree. One final point I would make to that question as well is that in BASWA we have a criminal justice national group I referred to in the BASWA section of this presentation, and I support that group. And myself and the previous chair, who kind of had that, you know, we looked after that group. It did feel for a few years as though we were kind of the last chance saloon almost in terms of social work's relationship with criminal justice. Quite often the work we were doing, it felt like it was just our group that was the last remaining kind of link between both professions. It does feel that we've made some progress in recent months. It's too early to tell, but there are some green shoots with the reunification of the probation service. In terms of race within all of this, as well, to come back to your point, there is clear evidence about how Black people are, you know, disproportionately stopped and searched, and, you know, we know all the data. There's just less. It's similar to social work. There's less in the way of actual initiatives and innovations to actually try and address that in a way that looks at the causal factors of why these people are getting themselves in that position in the first place. And it's more about, well, that person's crossed the line, they're a criminal, so we need to take a very punitive response. And I could talk all day about that, but you know, I don't believe that there is proper rehabilitation for criminals, and that's for all criminals. And I imagine that, you know, people of colour are disproportionately represented in that respect as well. So I hope that answers your question, Emma. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Okay, anybody else?
So we've got two more questions and a comment. So Shareem has said, do you honestly think change will be achieved as racism appears to be everywhere and in everything? People are not comfortable discussing these issues openly. These conversations don't take place at home. And Shareem continues, is there a framework to measure racism? How can you be sure you are being treated unfairly, as you stated in the theory of the problematic Black woman? It is the individual who is blamed and asked to change.
Yeah, well, first things first, I would say that I'm an optimist, hence why I'm sat here this morning talking to you about it. Because if I felt that there was no hope, then, you know, I'd just be doing something else. I think there is always hope, and I think that part of the function of anti-racism really is about raising awareness. And I'd like to feel that myself and BASWA have done you know, a decent body of work in that regard. So we've kind of amplified it within social work. More broadly than that, sort of society and other professions, to be honest, I've had to be quite blinkered and not even think about that. I've just tried not to think about outside of my bubble and just think, I'll deal with what's in front of me in terms of this work. I think if we begin to think too expansively as individuals, then it can feel a bit overwhelming, I think. So that's my kind of personal approach to it. From an organizational approach, it's different because obviously we've got more, this kind of governance and members view, and there's more people to be able to kind of do certain things. So there's a slightly, it's a different approach with that. So we will be looking to kind of host roundtables with regulators and so on, and other stakeholders in social work to try and get some structural and institutional change. So yeah, there's just different ways really, I guess, in which I view it depending on what hat I'm wearing at any particular time, if that makes sense. But I always try to hang on to optimism, and I always try to think, well, we've got to be realistic, and I'll talk more about my perspective on that shortly. I think it's important that we don't overwhelm ourselves with the size of the task really, and we break it down into incremental chunks. I hope that answers your question.
And also Maisie asks your thoughts about how we go about this work when the government has specifically spoken out against critical race theory being taught in schools and are essentially discrediting it as radical, particularly as being social workers, our work is so integrally shaped by government policy. Thanks for the presentation, is really, really informative.
Okay, thank you to that person. In terms of that political dimension of that question, well, the opposition to anti-racism that I was talking about, it comes in various forms and guises, and sometimes it comes from people of colour. It's not necessarily about, for me, individuals all of the time. It's more about institutions, structures, processes, education, these sort of big mechanisms that fuel white supremacy really. And once we can begin to get a handle on those things, then I think things hopefully will naturally fall into place. Obviously the government are responsible for all those kind of mechanisms, and again it comes back to being realistic for me about what myself as an individual, what my organization as one piece within the social work jigsaw kind of landscape, what we can actually do. I'm not going to sort of beat myself up about things that we can't do, because we need to come together as a collective, both as a profession and as a society, to do certain things. And if that isn't happening, all I can do is to try and push things in that direction as an individual, and that's all we can do as an organization as well. So it's just, for me, it comes back to the previous question in some ways, just about dealing with what's actually smart, specific, measurable, achievable, realistic targets, and within our sort of spaces that we occupy. I hope that answers your question.
And just a final comment from Fadima Adan. I think it's also worth mentioning how little we cover anti-racist practice within the social work degree. It's put under anti-discrimination, which it is, but I think it definitely needs its own modules.
I would agree with that, and that's something that I know that there is a movement within social work to decolonize curriculums. As I was saying earlier, I believe that's getting some traction. I'm in touch with various groups myself that are particularly focused in that area around education and so on. So again, we'll keep pushing in that direction. But this isn't kind of something that can be resolved just through a very kind of nice conversation. This is years and centuries really of white supremacy which we're having to kind of dismantle, and obviously this is very specific to social work that we're talking about, but there are so many kind of factors out there that are reinforcing this, some of which you've talked about in terms of government, but there are various other forces. So that's the resistance, that's the level of the resistance that we're up against. But some of this I think comes back to just doing the right thing, for human beings of all colours, of all backgrounds, and hanging on to those fundamentals.
So we do have two more people that have their hands raised. Amanda, is your hand raised?
Blimey, like buses.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it is. Thanks.
Hello there.
Hi, very good presentation, thank you. My question might be slightly twofold, but for somebody like myself going back into the 80s, I might be showing my age now, and seeing that there was a drive in the late 80s and 90s to get Black individuals onto the social work training program. And that came on board, but there was also like the infrastructure you could see was not there. There was the push to have them, they came on, but then I think the drive was to enable the social worker to connect a little bit more with the communities that they were working with, yet the support and the infrastructure wasn't there. So would we say that this was part of a structure that was almost tokenistic in having them there, but not really supporting them as social workers or helping them in their careers?
I agree. I think some of that, you've perhaps answered your own question there, really. Some of it is before my time, in all honesty, so I hold my hands up to that. But just from what I've heard from, veteran social workers who I, worked alongside earlier on in my career, that was, very much the thinking, I think, that lots of people had. And I think there's still probably aspects of that today, and that there's very little acknowledgement, as I was mentioning earlier, about the racism that people experience from both service users and their colleagues. It's probably not mentioned at all in the kind of the training, social work training, regardless of whether it's conventional or fast track. I imagine it's just not necessarily a kind of, a priority discussion in terms of, students, for example, experiencing racism from other students, and how that's, what protections and support are in place, sort of if and when that arises. And looking at it through this lens of anti-racism, then it is going to happen. So actually, what provisions are in place, to support people with that? That's the kind of perspective I look at it from. But then also in the, once people qualify and they're out into the working world, what protections and support do their employers provide for them? Is it discussed in supervision? In my experience, it's not, or very rarely, or if it is, it's piecemeal. Just depends on the personality of your manager, really. But there's nothing written down anywhere that says that you must, discuss issues of potential discrimination with your, with people you're supporting as a manager or as an organization or whatever. It's not in the policies and procedures, to my knowledge, quite often. And if it is, that's something that individual employer has done, as opposed to it being consistent and mandatory, across the country. Again, in terms of, just various aspects of social work, really, where is the abundant and kind of inescapable racism that people will face? Where is that acknowledged and kind of support? Where is this support available for people around that? Quite often it's not. So I hope that that answers your question in terms of my experience, more recent. But yeah, I can't go back to the 80s, unfortunately. I was not even in double digits then.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to move on if that's okay. I'm just conscious that I've invited lots of questions there. They all came in a flurry, and probably should crack on, really. So we've got about just under 10 minutes before the break. Is that all right, Amrit and Ella? Yeah?
All good.
Yeah? Okay, so moving on. Here are 3 typical responses to anti-racism from social work organisations, in my opinion. So from my cultured social work experience, the responses below generally indicate an organisation's prioritisation and level of commitment, or not, to anti-racism. The first type of response is to keep silent and keep things the same, and hope all this Black Lives Matter stuff just blows over. This kind of inaction and paralysis of fear correlates with and reinforces perceptions of white fragility, white privilege, and white supremacy for some people of colour. This type of organisational response usually commends staff for being resilient and deflects attention away from the essential redesign of systems that routinely make people suffer. The second type of response is to publish a lukewarm organizational statement that recycles and regurgitates previous rhetoric on workforce unity with predictable and borderline offensive platitudes, often proposing only superficial changes. For example, publishing a sympathetic but non-committal, knee-jerk brief statement, possibly delegating responsibilities to an already overworked equalities officer, or proposing minor changes to already vague policies and procedures on valuing diversity with little or no accountability. Approaches at this level are usually well-intended but tokenistic and overlook the nuanced obstacles and pitfalls people of colour face every day. Unfortunately, this response is common. And the final type of response is to publish an authentic anti-racism action plan outlining significant reforms that commit to specific, measurable, achievable, and realistic targets. And I include some on the next slides. For example, publishing a strong mission or position statement condemning George Floyd's murder and racism in all its forms, and committing to BASWA's Code of Ethics, anti-oppressive, anti-discriminatory, and anti-racist practice. This approach interlinks with the anti-racist commitment framework, which I've created, and I'll show you that shortly. The acid test is to share this presentation with your social work leaders and see what response you get. Here is a visual representation of those 3 responses. So this is an infographic of myself up against Manchester United goalkeeper David De Gea. You'll see the first response is dismal, where I shoot into the crowd. That translates into noteworthy silences. Anti-racism is not discussed, and there are no attempts to acknowledge or address racism. Leaders hope all this Black Lives Matter stuff just blows over. The second response is where I hit the stanchion, so between the post and the crossbar, and I fluffed it. This translates into cringe position statements and feeble blogs, recycled statements from years ago, regurgitated previous rhetoric on workforce unity with predictable platitudes but no action. Unfortunately, this response is common. And finally, the goal, which translates into authentic anti-racist action plans, they're published outlining significant reforms that commit to specific, measurable, achievable, and realistic targets. And of course, that's the aim. Now, I think there might be a good time to pause until about 5 past, if that's okay with you. Is that all right, Amrit?
Sounds good.
Yeah, actually, so I make it 58 minutes past. Yeah, how long is good? 5-10 minutes? What's good
I think
for
we
you?
said 10 minutes at the start.
10 minutes, yeah. Should we come back at 10 past 11 then?
Sure, let's do that.
Yeah, all right. See you shortly. See you, everyone. Okay. So to continue, here is the anti-racist commitment framework that I referred to earlier on, which is a framework that I created to share my suggestions around how organizations might address some of this work. So it's separated into 4 different strands. The first strand is around accelerating diversity within an organization. That's about building a workforce more reflective of the communities we serve by promoting opportunities for Black and ethnic minority people to enter and advance within organizations. Some of the actions that might arise from that is creating a fast-track scheme for high potential people from ethnic minority backgrounds, fueled by targeted recruitment for senior leadership, and work with partners to help grow diverse talent pools. Selected staff will be mentored by a member of the senior leadership team as they progress through different opportunities designed to build their career foundations. This will be maintained by ensuring there are diverse shortlists for every senior management role across the organisation. So that's the first strand. The second strand is educating, empowering and equipping people. So that involves transforming the working culture to zero tolerance of discrimination, introducing new immersive training to enhance awareness and support, to underpin inclusive management approaches and meet various learning styles. And that's something I feel particularly strongly about, meeting various learning styles. I don't think that anti-racism can really be delivered in a one-size-fits-all sort of way meaningfully. Some actions that might arise from that are race and culture awareness training is mandatory for everyone. This will go beyond routine online training by offering guidance, peer support groups, recognising local issues, providing support to equip managers to champion diversity, and utilising external specialist advice and support as and when necessary. So you'll see that strand really is about training and development. The next strand is about leading by example, and that's aimed at senior leaders and managers. And that's about ensuring that every senior leader has a greater understanding of the issues faced by ethnic minority communities and are equipped to lead the fight for equality. An action that might arise from that is every senior leader committing to either A, having an ethnic minority reverse mentor, which I'll mention, I'll elaborate on shortly, and also providing professional support to a community organisation serving ethnic minority groups. And the final layer is about building transparency, and that's about data collection and data usage. So any gaps in data collection will be addressed, ensuring that senior leaders can be held to account for the progress being made in tackling both discrimination and equality of opportunity. Some of that is taking place currently through a Department of Health and Social Care initiative called the Workforce Race and Equality Standards that you might want to look at. I've just been appointed to the advisory group for that, which I'm pleased about, alongside other colleagues, and hope to be able to push the anti-racism agenda. Some actions that might arise from building transparency then. So staff are encouraged to self-declare their identity, enabling a rich profile of the workforce's diverse needs to be built. This will underpin the introduction of an annual ethnicity pay audit, backed by any immediate action required. An ethnicity dashboard will help to track progress across the colleague life cycle and set targets for senior leaders. This will be published internally annually. So I hope that gives you some idea of some of my proposals from a kind of strategic point of view. I will elaborate later on as to what some of these things might actually look like in practice. But before I do that, here's another infographic on becoming anti-racist. Now, I think that this applies to individuals and organisations, as do many of the other infographics that I shared. But looking at the zones then, so we have the fear zone, the learning zone, and the growth zone. You'll see the different thoughts and narratives, considerations maybe that somebody might have as they go through each zone. So I'll give you a moment just to digest those. My only criticism of that infographic, which isn't one I've created, is that the growth zone, in my opinion, is infinite and ongoing. It's a lifelong journey that's both personal and professional. But I guess that's difficult to capture in an infographic. So I just wanted to share that with you. Okay, moving on. What needs to happen nationally? The existing national frameworks and initiatives to support social workers of colour are fragmented and optional. This creates confusion and dilution in their coherence and implementation in practice. Social work has a long history of committing to anti-discriminatory practice, but less in the way of practical mandatory implementation or robust challenge on these issues, and I alluded to that earlier. Now is the time for social work leaders to properly address this by meaningfully and purposefully moving this agenda forward by establishing a mandatory anti-discriminatory national framework that is universal across social work. An important first step would be to explicitly reintroduce anti-discriminatory, anti-oppressive practices and anti-racist values and ethics into the professional and qualifying education and training standards. This should also involve partnership working between key stakeholders to enforce these values and ethics across the professional landscape. Key aims and objectives should be to ensure consistency, introduce mandatory requirements, emphasize anti-racist values, and be universally applicable to all social workers, like the Professional Capabilities Framework and the professional standards. We all know that organisations can sometimes be avoidant of anti-racism, but as social workers, we must recognise that silence or inaction on racism is complicity with the oppressors. Unfortunately, as a profession, we have been complacent and have much more to do to cultivate equality, diversity, and inclusion in the workplace and society. The BAME conundrum. BAME does not describe who I am. BAME is a clumsy, cluttered, and incoherent acronym that is opportune for categorizing people of colour as a homogeneous group, when we quite clearly are not. Of course, I cannot speak for all people of colour. I understand that BAME can be operationally helpful when exploring the overarching effects of all things racist. However, it misses so much nuance and subtlety that it can be seized upon by those who wish to deny racism as a white problem. Routinely, I hear people comfortably stating that BAME people can't even agree amongst themselves. This sloppy reductivism leads to terms being invented, such as black on black crime. I never hear about white on white crime, ever. Now, the next few slides are my attempt to kind of visualize what an anti-racist working environment might look like, and what can social work employers do to promote anti-racism in the workplace. What would the experience be like for social workers of colour? So there are some practical suggestions that I outline, which I don't feel would be a huge financial investment for most organisations. It really just comes down to the willingness, motivation, and intention. So the first headline is around recruitment. Anti-racist recruitment targets are set to employ Black and ethnic minority senior leaders and educators to better reflect local communities and the workforce where necessary, stroke possible. Now, the reason for that caveat is that obviously the demographics are different in different parts of the country. So it really is about those employers, those leaders, those educators, looking at the local community, working with the local community, and identifying ways in which people from different minoritized and marginalized backgrounds can actually shape and influence the organization. The Rooney Rule is adopted, similar to senior recruitment in American football. This involves at least one person of colour candidate being interviewed for each senior leader vacancy. The next headline is around the workforce. So again, I'm continuing on this kind of idealistic theme. Anti-racism is explicitly promoted in mission and position statements. There's a good example there that I've included when you get your copy of this, along with other forms of discrimination, included in relevant policies and procedures, and it forms part of employees' employment contracts to underline its importance. Workforce diversity and protected characteristics such as ethnicity, gender, religion, sexuality, etc. informs the support available within the workplace, training for all staff, and organisational policies and procedures. So you'll see these are some of the ways in which anti-racism can be embedded within an organisation that won't necessarily have a huge financial investment, really just requires that inclination. The workforce is encouraged to self-declare their identity, and individual and group well-being at work provisions are developed in partnership with them. Personal well-being is a mandatory agenda item for supervision meetings. Provisions are also developed for those who have experienced workplace trauma associated with racism and other forms of discrimination. This includes peer-led support groups for members to reflect fully on their personal and professional experiences. By using this identity dashboard approach, organisational efforts are more focused and genuine. Progress is properly managed through a cycle of reviewing data output and periodic verbal and written feedback from the workforce. Safe and informal systems are introduced for social workers of colour and, workers generally, but it will benefit social workers of colour. Something like this would be introduced. So, for example, discriminatory practices or constructive solutions are made anonymously in an honesty box to empower people of colour without fear of reprisals. Arising issues are then explored in supervision, team meetings, or with senior leaders if necessary. I mentioned before about the annual ethnicity pay audits. This is to ensure that any anomalies and discrepancies for Black and ethnic minority staff are properly reviewed and resolved. And finally, BASWA created a COVID-19 risk assessment. Obviously, it feels like we're coming out of the pandemic now. I don't want to count my chickens. So this is probably less important to some degree now than it was a few months ago. But I was suggesting that assessment tool was used consistently for all staff, particularly those from Black and ethnic minority groups, because of the disproportionate outcomes from COVID-19. It may still be useful. I'm moving on. The next headline is on education. Anti-racist education is recognised as being at the heart of developing a more cultured and inclusive workforce and healthy workplace. Education providers decolonise social work programmes with the input of Black and ethnic minority academics, social workers, service users, all integrated at different stages of programme development and delivery. ADP, AOP and anti-racist practice form a fundamental and mandatory requirement of social workers' professional development and registration. This includes a range of educational tools and training opportunities, including the different learning styles I mentioned, to ensure quality cultural diversity education is prioritised and valued. Staff continuously learn and better understand microaggressions, stereotypes, and how they can demonstrate anti-racist practice. The expertise of specialist external trainers and consultants is instrumental in shaping effective anti-racist approaches, with no reliance on tokenistic online courses. And the specialist external trainers and consultants I refer to, I don't hold myself in that regard, but there are lots of very reputable people out there. And I think it's important that people with that knowledge and expertise really are utilised to make any meaningful change. I'm getting a bit of feedback there, folks. If I could just ask you all to go on mute again, please. Still getting a bit of feedback? I think it's okay now, thank you. In terms of allyship, anti-racist allyship is understood by senior leaders, educators, and practitioners to be vital in combating all manifestations of racism. Educating, empowering, and equipping allies to actively support colleagues from marginalised and minority groups is common practice. Allyship actively promotes ways in which managers and staff can become allies or become better allies to support their Black and ethnic minority colleagues. Social work employers and educators demonstrate they are willing to keep listening and learning from people of colour to instigate meaningful change. Here is an infographic just to consolidate some of what I've tried to capture in that last slide. And it's called the 7 A's of Authentic Allyship. Starting with appetite, do you have the appetite to immerse yourself in the complex, emotive world of race equality? Ask questions about race, be curious, read, learn, and educate yourself. Accept there is really a problem. More data isn't needed. Openly acknowledge that the problem needs to be dealt with. Apologize, express sympathy that racism is affecting people of certain races. Assume, don't. Instead, develop informed views by seeking to understand individuals. And finally, action. Take demonstrable action, steps to establish equality and be accountable. Again, that applies to individuals and organisations. And this isn't about pointing the finger, it's not about making people feel guilty. I think it's about a recognition of some of the different types of white identity that I referred to earlier on, and thinking, you know, where do I fall within this? And actually, how can I apply some of these principles of allyship, both personally and professionally, in a way that's authentic and staying true to myself? Okay, just continuing with this theme, reverse mentoring is the next heading. Anti-racist reverse mentoring enables Black and ethnic minority social workers to mentor senior leaders and educators on anti-racism, especially those with identified anti-racist needs. And that's a bit of a euphemism. It is important reverse mentoring allows mentors some autonomy in their approach. Furthermore, mentoring agreements considering confidentiality, power dynamics, and conflict resolution are agreed and signed by both parties at the outset. Leadership programs. To combat glass ceiling racism, I referred to the BPS group earlier on that I founded. An event that we hosted last year was called Smashing the Glass Ceiling, which was all about looking at the career progression for social workers of colour and the glass ceiling that most people will reach when they try and get beyond sort of, you know, team manager, head of service. When they try to apply for more senior roles, quite often there are, you know, a series of barriers that they face. So that event was actually really well received and well attended. So I'd encourage you to have a look at that. That link will take you to that recording of that event. So to combat glass ceiling racism, various professional development opportunities are available, designed to provide advice and support for colleagues from different ethnic and cultural backgrounds to enhance their career progression. Positive representation recognises the disadvantages and obstacles for people of colour and provides opportunities, including traditional mentoring, nominations, secondments, shadowing, etc., to support them in reaching their full potential. Due to the representational imbalance, ring-fenced investment and operational resources to support leadership programs is in place. This addresses the lack of Black and ethnic minority social workers in senior roles and provides support for those who are. Now this is the final slide, so we've actually done fantastically well for time. Probably with there being not so many questions, I've been able to rattle on. But this is the final slide, which I hope consolidates much of what I've tried to capture in those last few slides in terms of that ideal working environment that I was talking about. So how can managers change the culture of their organization? Well, they can firstly start by changing what people do rather than how they think. It's easier to act your way to a new way of thinking than to think your way to a new way of acting. Give employees the means by which they can successfully do their jobs. And finally, recognize that the way that problems are treated reflects your corporate culture. Obviously, not all social work organizations are corporate, but I still feel that that slide is relevant. Thank you for listening to my presentation, and I hope you got something from it.
Thank you so much, Wayne. Are you open for more questions?
For sure, yeah.
And Karina has their hand raised.
Hello there.
Hi, Wayne. Thank you so much for the presentation this morning. It's been great and really insightful. I just wanted to ask a question. This was one of the earlier slides that you'd shown towards the start, but it showed the example of a social worker who had been forced to still go and visit service users who had suspected cases of COVID-19, even though her white counterparts were staying in the office and keeping the PPE for themselves. So I guess I'm just curious to understand, if we were put in a similar situation to that one, how would we sort of navigate that? Just because, especially with myself, as part of the Think Ahead program, I'm going to be based in the Northwest, and I have heard from like other people who are Black social workers around the Northwest that sometimes they're forced to go into, let's say, areas that are predominantly known to be EDL areas.
Right.
So again, I'm just curious, like if we were put in a position where we're sort of known to go into those areas or going to be forced to go in alone, is there sort of safeguarding policies, or would you just have to sort of raise that to your line manager?
Well, there are a number of options I think that are available. Firstly, yes, in terms of your line manager, I think for sure you'd have to have that conversation initially, and I think they have a duty to make you aware of any intelligence that there might be around specific areas that might pose a risk, or individuals that might pose a risk. But also, if you become aware or have any concerns, then yeah, I think that you have to have that conversation with your line manager initially. If, you know, unfortunately, like some of the people I mentioned in the slide, you find yourself in a position where maybe decisions are being made knowingly or in a way that actually isn't supportive or just outright racist, then if you were a BASWA member, then we have an advice and representation service where we will be able to advise you and represent you in sort of discussions and dialogue that you might have with your employer around that. We also have an affiliation with the Social Workers Union that I mentioned earlier on, who are a trade union, who were also able to represent members. They usually represent members with the regulator, so should people have issues with fitness to practice and so on. But yeah, so those are some options that are available. I think it's also important, as I was mentioning in the presentation, that like-minded alliances are formed within the workplace. As much as I'm for safe spaces for people of colour to be able to offload to each other, I think that's important. I also think it's important that there are other informal groups, which, you know, places where allies and potential allies can discuss issues with people of colour as well. You know, those don't have to be formal groups, as I say. You know, I don't think minutes need to be taken or anything like that, but it is providing people with that security, I guess, and that opportunity to be able to look at what's affecting not just people on issues of race, but any forms of discrimination within the workplace. And I think that people have greater strength in numbers, both vocally, but also in terms of activism within the workplace as well, should that be needed. So I hope that answers your question.
It does. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We have a question from Maisie, who asks, would you suggest some kind of pay incentive or other rewards for reverse mentoring and other kinds of support for this, just so that this doesn't put lots of pressure on additional pressure on Black staff or other staff of colour? Sorry if you said this already and I missed it.
That's all right. In terms of reverse mentoring, it's something that I've seen implemented in some places and it works well. I've seen it implemented in other places and it's not worked so well, partly because of some of the caveats that I included around mentoring agreements being set up from the outset around confidentiality and considering power dynamics and conflict resolution. Some of those things just weren't looked at. In terms of funding, I'm not sure if funding is necessarily necessary for that. I mean, it might be, depending on how far an organisation wants to advance with it. It's more about that commitment, really, to the essence of reverse mentoring and the reversal of those power dynamics, and the importance of what the person of colour has to say. I mean, you know, again, race is one lens in which to look at reverse mentoring. Of course, there's many other protected characteristics in which reverse mentoring could take place as well. But just looking at this through the race lens, I think it's important that the power that power dynamic is looked at, and that some of where I've seen reverse mentoring fall down is where the senior leader has come to those meetings with an agenda and they've just been oblivious to the power that they hold, basically. And so the person of colour has kind of been in submission, where they've just had, when passive, they've had to just kind of go along with the agenda of the senior leader. So it's important that some of those things are documented and agreed at the outset. And you know, there's lots of resources online now, I think, about reverse mentoring. So it's done in an ethical way, essentially. Thank you.
Thank you. Looks like we don't have any more. Oh, wait, okay. 2 people just raised their hands. We've got Will Burke.
Yep. Hi, Wayne.
Hello there.
Wayne, this might actually be a silly question, but I will ask it anyway.
Okay, that's all right.
Like me as a white person, and probably will get involved with Black people or ethnic minority people. But you said before, or you mentioned that as well in your presentation, that you need to build bridges, you need to build a relationship, etc. But how is it with Black people and ethnic minority people? How are they feeling? How they need to work with somebody like me, a white person? Do you feel that some of Black people and ethnic minority, that they already have a picture in their head as well? So if, oh, you're white, you're not going to do anything for me, etc.
Okay. Yeah. All right.
Do you feel that this is because of what happened in the past, that this might be a problem as well?
I think for sure that could be a problem, but I think it's hypothetical. And I think that this is twofold, I suppose, my answer. One is that I think as human beings that we're hardwired to be judgmental and to have our own preconceptions, and that's part of kind of survival of the fittest, I guess. So I think we have to be self-aware enough to be able to acknowledge that in lots of different ways, and the prejudices that we bring to every situation. And then looking at it from the other side as well, I think that there may be an element of that for some people of colour, but not for all, because as I mentioned before, we're not a homogenous group. I certainly can't speak for everybody, but I can speak for myself, and I can say that there will be some situations, there have been situations where I've had preconceived ideas about individuals or scenarios, and I thought, oh, I'm not going to go there because I can imagine that there's not many Black guys that go there, and what sort of looks am I going to get? And you know, that's the kind of lived reality, I think, for many Black people. But then occasionally, you know, quite a lot actually, I've been pleasantly surprised. And there have been people who've completely, you know, crushed any stereotypes that I might have about certain sections of the society based on, you know, my preconceived ideas. And that for me is one of the real beauties of humanity. You know, I like that, not just when, you know, I come across a white person, I think, oh, they might be racist, and they surprise me and they're not racist. You know, that goes for any aspect of life where I think you're pleasantly surprised and you say, well, that person's proved me wrong. I'm the sort of person where I'm all right to be proved wrong. I don't mind being proved wrong if it's in the sense that, oh gosh, that's just highlighted something I need to work on. I think quite often, as far as race is concerned, I talked about white fragility in the presentation. Sometimes that can manifest itself in defensiveness. It can manifest itself in blame culture, when actually it just needs to be holding your hand up and saying, you know what, I said the wrong thing there, sorry about that.
Yeah.
I think in a lot of situations that will resolve things. Or I really don't know much about this race stuff. I'm at the beginning of my anti-racism journey. I don't want to say the wrong thing, but can I talk to you about this? You know, that sort of approach, most people, I think, would be okay with. Hope that answers your question, Will.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you very much.
Got another question from Katie. Are there any ways, either through Think Ahead or BASWA, that people can report or discuss with someone racist or discriminatory behaviour, especially if it is amongst senior members of staff, supervisors or managers?
Yeah, for sure. I talked about the advice and representation service earlier on. That's available to all BASWA members. So, oh, getting a bit of feedback there. Sorry, somebody clearing their throat, I think. Yeah, we've got the advice and representation service, and that's available to all BASWA members. It's a service where if somebody is experiencing discrimination, you know, that's very much what it's set up for. So, you know, by all means, get in touch with us. It's not something I profess to, you know, I don't get involved in individual cases, if you see what I mean. My role, I guess, is more about the workforce generally. So as far as employee issues, I would signpost you to my colleagues in A&R.
Thank you. I don't think there are any more questions or hands raised unless I've missed anyone. I can't see anyone on my screen.
That's fine.
But yeah, thank you so much for an amazing presentation. Just before we finish off, I wanted to put a feedback form into the chat. So that link should work for everyone. And if you could take a few minutes just to fill in those 3 questions about how you found this event, and if you are a social worker, you can put in how this will potentially be implemented in your practice, or anything you've learned that you can implement into your practice as well. And while you're filling that out, Ella, would you like to say a few words?
It'd be nice to see that feedback, Amrit, if possible.
Yep, I'll definitely share it with you. That
would be great. And also, if people don't mind, for those who are happy to have their cameras on, it'd be nice to have a picture that I could post on my social media. I'm a bit of a social media phobe, to be honest, but the anti-racism stuff has just sent me the other way. But I'm really trying to promote the movement, so I do like to get a photo where I can. So if you're comfortable with your camera being on, please place it on, and I'll take a quick pic. Okay, I will give you warning, don't worry before I do it. I'm just trying to sort my screen out. Here we go. All right, so 3, 2, 1, say cheese. There we go, perfect. All right, thank you for that. Ella, over to you.
Thanks, Wayne, and thanks, Amrit, for organising this event. And thank you, everyone, for coming and giving up your time this morning. It's brilliant to have a group of people, Think Ahead staff, people on the programme, alumni. It's fantastic to all be together. This is such an important issue, and it's one that I'm really grateful to Wayne for his support, sort of personally and professionally, because I reached out to him a while ago and explained that as a group of colleagues, we were really trying to make Think Ahead an actively anti-racist organisation, and the more help and support we can get on that journey with people feeding in ideas, as Wayne has done so eloquently this morning, that are really practical, the better, because we can have these aspirations and we can have this sort of commitment as a group of colleagues and staff, but actually turning that into an organisational strategy, doing the right thing and then holding ourselves to account is a journey. We're on it, and I'm really grateful to Wayne for sort of supporting us in that direction. But I have to say the presentation was so rich with ideas and things that we can all really take away into our day job and think about, but also challenge the managers and people that we're working with to come with us on that journey. So it felt like bringing it down to the sort of day-to-day level of what can we actually do and expect, and what changes feel reasonable to ask for and reasonable to implement is just so helpful, because often I go to these sorts of conversations and people are left thinking, what can I do differently? How can I actually take this into my day job? So Wayne, I'm really grateful to you for feeding us not just some of the theory and some of the things that that you've written about and said, but other people have too brought to this debate, but actually try and taking that down to very, very specific as a social worker, as a newly qualified social worker. What can you do? What can you expect? What can we do to take everyone with us on this journey? There was so much in there for us to sort of do and think about. I'm really struck by one of the sort of late questions that came in about basically what do we do when we see racist practice in our workplace, with our managers, people who are more senior to us. Please do reach out to Think Ahead as well if you're experiencing racism in the workplace. The practice specialists are there to support you. If you're a participant on the programme, we really want to know if you're having that type of experience in your day job, so that we can support you through that. But not just that, we can talk to your managers and senior people in the organisations and challenge that behaviour. So please don't feel that we don't have an interest. We've got an active interest to know if anyone's in that situation at work at the moment. And people who have left the programme and in the alumni network, similarly, AMRIT's role is to try and bring us together as a group of people that can support each other, can help each other through these sort of difficult times. And similarly, please do tell AMRIT, reach out to me if you're experiencing racism in the workplace, so we can think about how we can support you. Even though you're not on the programme, you are part of our family, and we want to work together to address racist practice where we see it. So basically, please do keep this conversation going. Please do, as part of your evaluation, tell us how you want us to build on this event, take it forward with Wayne, with colleagues across the sector, in a way that is good for you and helps you. So this is the conversation that we want you to all be actively part of. We've recorded this session, so we'll tell other people about it. We'll hopefully share it, but please do mention it to your friends and colleagues if you think it would be useful for them to dip in and see all of it, bits that you found particularly interesting. It will be there as a resource for everybody. But just to say thank you again for giving up your time. Huge thank you to Wayne for everything that you do, and I'm going to hand back to Amrit to close the session.
Okay.
Thanks so much, Ella. So like Ella said, we are recording this session, and I'll be sending the slides through as well by email in the next few days as well. But you have my email address. Let me know if you have any further questions or any suggestions for future events as well. But other than that, I hope you really have a great rest of your day and rest of your week. And again, thank you so much for coming to this event.
Thanks, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.